Hello and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I am one of your hosts, McCosk,
And I'm your other host, Bronze.
and on today's episode, we have decided on the weird but interesting topic of the politics of artistic movements. Well,
That's right.
I suppose we should start by defining what an artistic movement is. So, how do I put this in a simple and compact way? An artistic movement is when a bunch of artists, typically throughout a period in time, though sometimes they can be very focused, start doing art with similarities in between them. Is that good enough, or is this like too much of a bottom of a barrel of a definition?
I think it's a good starting point. But yeah, I think an artistic movement, because now we're jazzing. I think an artistic movement is when there's a group in a specific period of time that share a common philosophy or goal in their art.
So,
Usually approached by similar stylistic means.
so to you, it's less about the output itself, but more so about the philosophy behind said output.
Yeah, but I think that the philosophy behind it is integral to what the output looks like.
True enough. True enough. So, so I guess we can define for simplicity's sake artistic movements as uh, essentially philosophies applied to art. Not to say that art in of itself cannot be philosophical. It's merely that these themselves are philosophies attached to them. Now, unbeknownst to many, or known, who we don't know exactly how you feel about this, dear listener, but truth be told, many artistic movements have had ideological connotations behind them, particularly, well, not only by the artists themselves being militant in this or that political movement, but also more indirectly by being a direct inspiration to said movement. Now, to avoid covering every single artistic movement in history, we'll start with the modern ones, namely Romanticism going forward. Romanticism is a funny one. Okay, okay. Romanticism is difficult to give a good descriptor because it lasted a very long time, with some people believing what killed Romanticism was World War One, and what started it being the Napoleonic Wars.
I
And
mean, most sources that I have seen put it earlier. Some say that Rousseau is the beginning of
I
Romanticism.
suppose I might have been giving a very Portuguese-centric definition. Because over here it is openly considered to have been the French invasions and the Napoleonic Wars that were the root cause. Because over here, Romanticism is kind of painted as this movement that started as basically young kids that were just kids or teenagers during the Napoleonic Wars that grew up hearing the stories of basically like the wars and the yada yada heroics and the entire personage of Napoleon, that then essentially went about creating this mythologized reality in their paintings and works that they essentially had missed out on. So like over here, Romanticism is very connoted to like nostalgism.
I mean, I think there is a nostalgic element to Romanticism, but I think the core element is the focus on emotions.
That is true. Very much emotive.
Right, and also like new concepts of emotion that are derived from the Enlightenment, like the new concept of the sublime is something that's often portrayed in Romanticism, or the particular beauty of nature.
I mean, a seminal painting of Romanticism is just the dude upon a cliff, just
Yeah,
looking at the
Wanderer Above the Sea Fog, very by
that one.
that one. Yeah, yeah. We'll put them in the description, like we did in the last art episode.
Also, this is indeed fact a hard episode. In case you hadn't noticed it, dear listener. But yeah, but Romanticism is interesting because, like, again, it lasted so long that it acquired very different meanings. Because at start, yeah, it had this mythologizing, and by the end, it was almost an act of defiance to be romantic to a certain degree, like a defiance against a hope beyond hope about a beauty in the horrors of industrial exploitation in Europe.
Yeah, and also a key element of Romanticism was no longer focusing as much on classical antiquity as perhaps earlier periods like the academic painters and like the Enlightenment writers had, but a new focus on the Middle Ages as a very emotional period, where they had, according to Romantics, much clearer ideals, which is why, for example, a lot of Romantics, like, say, Wagner would make operas out of Arthurian legend, and Tennyson would write Arthurian poems, and many of these medieval themes, often attached to national mythologies, became very big in the Romantic era.
Well, the Romantics in general also created many a national mythology. Case in point being the one from Finland. Oh God, I forgot it. The name. The but yeah, that whole thing was made up on the spot during the period of Romanticism, for no other purpose than the Finnish, so that the Finnish would also have a national epic or national mythology to contrast in place of all other countries that had a national mythology. The
The
but
Kalevala is what it's called. That's the
yeah, the Kaleva. Even though that's not how you pronounce it, that's how I did when I went to Finland.
yes. One of the political aspects of Romanticism can said to be nationalism, in that they were often tied. I mean, not all Romantics were nationalists, but there came to be a strain of Romanticism that was very much tied to nationalism, and you could even say that the modern concept of nationalism wouldn't exist without Romanticism.
Indeed, it is self-evident. But there is here's the issue. Like Romanticism is so interesting because a superficial analysis gives a cookie cutter result, but like a more in-depth analysis, like it gets weirder results that you don't expect. Because again, Romanticism is also the artistic style of, well, the last artistic style. Let's be honest here, of the absolutists essentially, and the strong medievalism. A good example of like this weird somewhat ideological alignment was Charles X of the Bourbons, the last Bourbon king, who had a deliberately medievalist coronation in and in general the regime had lots of tones of medievalism, inspired of by at the time romantics, but you do have romanticism was really the last artistic style that had at least elements of it. A somewhat unexpected, I suppose, not just pro monarchism, because all other artistic styles had at one point or another some schmuck that was pro monarchism. We're talking about like specifically pro absolutism. It was the last one. Again, Charles X is like the epicenter of that. But at the same time, you also have like elements of proto-communism, not proto-communism, proto-socialism. Pick the word. But because like, dear listener, a lot of these movements spawn its successors. Like, rarely is a new artistic movement created by an outsider that just has radically different views. This is like a process. And we have somewhat arbitrarily defined the beginning of the process with Romanticism, even though it's like an eternal continuum that goes back all the way back to cave paintings. The so like when you actually go and study and look into these things in depth, and like the various artists and what they thought and what they did and why they did it, you can find elements, especially in romanticism, of like both what would later become and was at the time far right, just plain simple, and like what would eventually become like far leftism in just the in like periods of the Romantic era.
Yeah, I mean there are definitely both conservative and radical romantics.
Yeah. Also, another thing but this is more of a clarification. When we say one movement got superseded by another, we just mean that like this next movement kind of took the limelight, but this does not necessarily mean that the previous movement ceased to exist. Indeed, fact, you could, I don't know, with sufficiently good Google foo, just find a modern day artist, digital or otherwise, that is just like textbook romantic. That's not the point we're making. It's like the limelight passed to another movement. But so, after Romanticism comes Realism, a deliberate reaction to the somewhat saccharine depictions of everyday life, because Romanticism did have some depictions of everyday life, and predictably, they were very saccharine. With
But
a
also,
carry on.
Romanticism has a very much a focus on individuals, and very specifically spectacular individuals, right? There is in Romanticism the notion, somewhat self predictably, of the romantic, right? Like in one of the earliest romantic works. Well, I don't know about the exact chronology, but one of the founding ones, by Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther, who is, of course, himself the textbook romantic, dominated by his passions, extremely refined sensibilities, not in the sense that, he is rich, but in the sense that he is very deeply in contact with his own soul. Right, and then so he feels all these strong emotions, and then, spoiler alert for a 230-year-old book, he kills himself. And so there is the idea in Romanticism of the romantic, and that, so whether that be someone who, pursues dramatic romantic love and then has to flee, or someone who has spectacularly devotes themselves to some sort of ideal. And other people, is not something that Romanticism concerns itself with. It thinks that the people worth studying are the Romantics. And so realism responds to this with the observation that most people aren't romantics, and that what we instead should focus on are types.
Also,
Because,
somewhat unrelated to this, I have to to make a slight clarification to the listener. Bronze reads more than me, and I, for the sake of balance, I guess, though this might not be strictly true, I see more paintings than Bronze, even though I have an extreme difficulty remembering the names. So, like, when I'm talking, assume most of the times I'm talking about the movement in a in portrait in like paint in like via the medium of painting. When Bronze is talking, think he assume that he's talking from the point of literature.
or maybe even music.
Or that. Because I must admit, although I saw a shit ton of romantic paintings, romantic literature is something that, yeah, I guess I kind of passed me by during my education and personal life. Well, never too late to try, I guess.
Yeah, Romanticism is most famous for, I would say, its painting and its poetry. Though, of course, there are plenty of very notable romantic novels. I'd say perhaps the most significant of, that's a very personal opinion, by the way, would be Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, because it's such like a world-defining work.
Hmm. No,
But
I
yeah,
can see it.
as I was saying, well, I mean, it created science fiction for one.
Hmm. Horror as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. So that's like the great romantic novel. There you go. You heard it here. But realism is much more famous for its novels, I would say. And as I
Yeah.
was saying,
So
realism is the focus of types, because the goal of realism as art is social commentary and to affect social change.
So, predictably, a lot of early to actual socialists, uh, I'd liked it or actually painted it, because a lot of these artists were, I mean, artistry in the early like the 20th century was, and politics were often very strongly connoted.
Yeah, so a significant painting we can look at for realism would be The Gleaners by Jean-Francois Millet, which is a painting that features women working in a field, uh, participating in an ancient practice called gleaning, in which the agricultural workers, especially the serfs, although these in the painting are no longer serfs, go out and pick the grain that's left after the main harvest, and that they get to keep for themselves. But it's very laborious, and obviously it's like not much grain that we're talking about. And so this is a painting that, and this will also be in the description, features the type of the agricultural laborer, and it makes a social point about the state of agriculture and also equality in France.
Indeed. And that same painting is an excellent example of the main political association of this. Because although I did mention socialists and communists and what have you, the ones that dominated realism truly were the radicals. Now, the radicals are a fairly obscure group these days because, well, I guess the term got turned into a verb. But the radicals were a group of liberals. They were, I mean, it's not wrong to call them radical liberals, but that's not exactly the point. They were not liberals, but angry. They saw themselves as the true liberals because radicalism, its root comes from radis, roots. So they did not see themselves as a radical faction. They saw themselves as a back to roots faction, for lack of a better term. And the essential goal of the radicalists was more freedom. And the radicals would eventually split and cease to exist by splitting into what eventually would be the libertarians, absolute political freedom, and the democratic socialists, and like they would later join a lot of socialist and communist movements, essentially espousing that a part of political freedom is also economic freedom. And the painting in question, the Gleaners, kind of exemplifies this duality immediately and centrally by both pointing out that even though feudalism has been abolished for at that point quite a few decades, that the political freedom does not quite match up to the doesn't is a not that much because they are still essentially peasants, and also the economic and also the lack of economic freedom by the fact that they are essentially gleaming the lands desperately and laboriously trying to find some grain, predictably either feed themselves or their families.
Yeah, I mean, I would say especially early on, a lot of the realists were the radicals, but I think there is definitely, especially as you go onwards into the 1860s and 70s, a much greater liberal bent to the radicals.
Yeah,
To the realists, I mean.
yeah, but that's because like Marxism became a thing. So like the pro economic freedom dudes just eventually became. I mean, the stereotype is that they all became social democrats, but like that's kind of a gross simplification. But they essentially started militating in less openly liberal groups.
Good one.
Militating.
Yeah, because
Fucking
Millet. Yeah. Sure.
that
Okay.
that that's that's not what I meant. That was an accidental pun.
It was a great pun, though.
I hate myself. But an interesting fact about realism is that not everyone experienced it. Well, or experienced it much delayed. I know for a fact that Portugal and Brazil, to a similar extent, did not actually get realism in the. I mean, they didn't get it when it first started because, like, a lot of these movements were fairly global-ish. A couple of years here of difference here and there, but in general, they were relatively. They spread relatively quickly, largely because back then most artists, well, artists still do that, but back then because there were less artists and most of them collaborated and went to Paris to talk about, it spread fast, more than one would expect, considering the limited technology at the time. But
Also, I just want to say, uh, by globally, Mikosk means in the European world.
oh come on, America also participated in this.
Yeah, America's part of the European world. That's
Okay. Jeez
right, because I
Louise,
don't.
you being fair enough, fair enough.
No, I just want to make a point that, like, not everywhere in the world was having these movements, and obviously, there's a lot of art in the world, and this one isn't the only story that matters. So that's important.
Fair admonitions, but now I'm imagining what would like realist mirror paintings look like. Huh. Really should get cracking on that as a civilization, I guess. Um, but outside of Bronze's honest admonishment, honest and necessary, Portugal and Brazil did not actually experience realism. Well, we did eventually get it, of course, but we had a movement that was fairly unique to us, and that is Ultra-Romanticism or late Romanticism, depending upon the exact terminology. But like, I prefer the term ultra because it kind of emphasizes the absurdity it got to. Ultra-Romanticism was primarily a literary genre. I am not, maybe in Brazil there are ultra-romantic paintings, but in what people who dislike Romanticism think Romanticism is actually what Romanticism just was, or Ultra-Romanticism just was. With people committing suicide for the slightest complications, with romantic triangles resulting in a body count upwards of 24 people, sometimes all of them suicides, sometimes all of them murders, and and in one now I'll avoid the individual examples, but generally speaking, ultra-romanticism is not remembered fondly because it is nowadays, though some of this or that work may be salvageable, are considered it's kind of considered a bit of a trash literary movement because the quality of the production was not very good. It had degenerated essentially to just tropism to the extreme. And predictably in Portugal, like this is like the version of the story I know. If we have any Brazilian listeners, I'm sure they would be delighted to tell us the whole shebang in our Discord, or via email, or via YouTube comment, or wherever else you find a way to contact.
We don't usually respond, but we do read them.
Yeah, we have a right and proper laugh. But basically, you had ultra-romanticism, which was seen as being trash, and then you had realism, and because this actually took quite a while to change, modernism as well, and futurism. I mean, the way Portugal experienced modernism and futurism and realism, because they all came very compact and very back to back over here in Portugal. It's difficult to quite give the explanation, but let's just focus on. But like the main outlier of the thing is ultra-romanticism, and that the conflict between the dominance of ultra-romanticism and other artistic styles was such a thing that it was even a topic in the literature itself. A seminal Portuguese book, Os Maias, the Mayans, I suppose would be a literal translation, but it's not about the Mayans, the civilization, it's about the Maya family. And one of the many conflicts in that book is literally like the decadent ultra-romantics and their conflict against, I believe in that book it is the realists. I think it's contrasted against the realists. So it's like this small microcosm of the experience that resulted in a somewhat unique, though not very noteworthy, artistic movement, while the rest of the Western world, for lack of a better term, was swarmed by well, not swarmed, it was a very gradual process, by realism and the subsequent styles. Oh, I nearly forgot. The main association with ultra-romanticism was, it's difficult to explain, but basically monarch. Yeah, for simplicity's sake, to not give it like an overview of 1800s to early 1900s Portuguese political history, let's just assume that it had broadly monarchical connotations. with the other styles here clumped up into a single whole, being variatingly either reformist or just straight up Republican. But yeah, that was it. Sorry.
Yeah, and obviously we could go on to talk about any number of to get back to realism, any number of realist works and their use of type to elicit social commentary, like the description of the various classes in the works of Dickens. But I should like to talk about a very specific work of realism that I think is very interesting, which is Austrian realism and its relation to Austro-liberalism. And I think this relationship is exemplified in perfectly in the novel by Stifter called Der Nachsommer, or Indian Summer in English. And we'll talk more about what Austro-liberalism like very specifically is in another episode that we have planned coming in the next 10 years maybe. And Der Nachsommer is a Bildungsroman, and the Bildungsroman is a novel that portrays the protagonist all the way from childhood into adulthood. However, Nachsommer in particular takes the title of Bildungsroman very literally, in that it relates to the very Austrian notion of Bildung, which they will get back to. Essentially, it's about a character who grows up in this bourgeois household, but then over his adulthood, over his adolescence, meets an aristocrat who is essentially a recluse in his own home, and essentially sort of moves in with him, and they start talking together, and and their relationship is the focus of the book. And essentially it turns out over the course of the novel, spoiler alert, that he is in fact not an aristocrat by birth but an aristocrat by service. But he has dedicated his life to achieving Bildung, which is this sort of artistic sensual ideal of Austro-liberalism, by rescuing old antiques from the Kopfenzeit, which is I believe is German for Age of the Ponytail, which is a sort of a derogatory term for the 18th century in Austro-liberal realist circles. And he devotes all his time to reading and looking at paintings and gardening. And so he is very literally portraying the notion in Austro-liberalism that one becomes an aristocrat not because of any titles or blood one has, though it is related, but because by cultivating a sort of artistic virtue in oneself. So that's a very specifically Austro-liberal angling of realism. But in Der Nachsommer, Freiherr von Riesach, who is the aristocrat whom he meets in the Rosenhaus, which is this building where all of the Bildung happens, is sort of a type for the aristocrat by virtue that the Austro-liberals espoused.
Mm-hmm. You actually also have something similar in ultra-romanticism, but again, it's not quite an ultra-romanticism, but you do. But again, in the seminal book Ujmayas, you also have a contrast between the old aristocracy by blood, essentially, and the bourgeois versus the bourgeoisie versus the versus a new aristocracy. Again, that book is very good. If a decent English translation exists, I recommend reading it, even if the context would be somewhat lost.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to look into it. Yeah, but overall, I would definitely say that realism is quite a bourgeois movement, especially because it led to various extents, but especially in Scandinavia, to the so-called poetocrats, which were
Oh.
these. The poetocrats were essentially like very influential social critic realist writers who became politicians.
Oh. Wow, that's fairly unique. Wait, is that why you have so many statues of like writers and poets over there?
In
Because
Scandinavia,
yeah.
I think that's definitely part of it, but essentially that there was this sort of, because if the goal of the literature is social commentary, that means that the authors have a very explicit desire to change society, meaning that, they're more likely to be directly political. And of course, if they're very rich already and very influential, then they will use that influence to
To reach their artistic goals in real life.
yeah.
Hmm. Not thinking if we had anything similar. I mean, now I'm just thinking on like the social critique angle, and I know that realism was like that stick, but I'm now just remembering like because like this entire episode is just like a trip down memory lane during the stuff we studied in Portuguese class over in here, and I'm just reminding of the manifest of the boat to hell. Again, a literalist translation of the title "Alto da Barca do Inferno" was also out completely outside of the scope of realism. Like it's a Renaissance play basically that is just purely social critique. And I'm just now thinking, like, wonder what realists would make of that. Because like the play was underappreciated for centuries.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like they could have been into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, not all realist works were always about social commentary, and obviously, that was just the overarching trend. But for example, if we say look at Dostoevsky as an example of realism, because realism that is not only about topic but is also about style. So obviously, as one might guess from the name, realist painting is quite photorealistic in that it depicts real people as they appear in the real life. And for example, realist prose is very clear, and often some realists go as far as to say, sadly, I can't think of a good English example, though I'm sure one exists that I'm familiar with. I just can't think of one off the top. But the Norwegian realist Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, for example, wrote in such a way that you could never see inside the minds of the characters in his book. Right?
Because
So
that's
they
not
didn't have.
something you can do. Yeah, because that's not something
Yeah.
you can do in real life. Huh.
Yes, essentially, uh, realist works are often all about dialogue. Essentially, it's people going into rooms and talking to each other. And for example, in realist theatre, the main mode was something called looking box theatre. Essentially, you would set up a room as you would have it in real life, and then all of the play would happen in said room with characters leaving and entering the room. But essentially, it was a completely ordinary room just filled with characters. So you didn't have the elaborate stage changes that you could perhaps have in Romantic or earlier works. It's not to say that every play in between 1850 and 1890 was a looking box theatre, just that that was a very, very popular mode of doing it. And obviously, realist works featured, things that the viewers or the readers could relate to.
Such as hunger, starvation, violence, and thereabouts.
Well, yes, also those things, but also more trivial things like brand names and street names and, you know,
Fair
so that they could.
enough. I'm just, I guess I just take that for so granted these days. Then, yeah, no, that back then would have been a thing, wouldn't it?
It definitely would have been, because you have to look pretty hard to find like a brand name or even a street name in a romantic work.
Yeah, now that you mention it.
And I think that's realism pretty well served. And obviously,
Indeed.
from then on, we go to the next stage in this sort of movement centric version of art history, to naturalism.
Naturalism is difficult for me to cover because, believe it or not, the dominion of naturalism in Portugal was like the dominion of historians in Portugal. One of our greatest historians, indeed, fact, the father of Portuguese historiography, was also a naturalist poet, I think. Or was he a writer? Well, poets are writers, but I can't quite remember what the main body of his work was. But we did have naturalists. We also did have naturalists, very focused on bucolic, on bucolicism, 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 bucol. Pictures and paintings and poems relating to the countryside and natural beauty, and in a very Portuguese centric way, the tragedies, the nymphs of the Tagus River, important literary figures in Portuguese literature, because well, they had to be in literature. What else would they be? So yeah, so I'm sorry to say, Bronze, but on this one, you're going to have to cover the ground. I'm not that familiar.
Yeah, so naturalism is something of a controversial art movement, in that some people say that it never existed at all, because there is essentially one major naturalist, Zola. Yeah, and essentially, naturalism continues in the footsteps of realism, in that it's focused on people and it's focused on social commentary, but it is no longer as focused on types. It allows itself to go deeper into the subconscious, and also it experiments a lot more with form. For example, naturalist works are much more often set in the first person, but many argue that is not enough to make it a separate movement from realism, especially because in its time span, it essentially covers a much shorter period of time, about 1890 to 1910, let's say. And even then, it overlaps with other movements like realism and the very early modernism.
Makes sense. But yeah, in Portugal, while in true traditional artistic movements in Portugal, there's no more than 3 to 5 names because, of course, um, it's weird, but over here it's definitely considered like a thing because like yeah, like poetry in first person is very much a naturalist thing, especially poetry in the first person while you're walking through the countryside, observing the natural beauty. I guess Portuguese naturalism just focuses less on the people and more like on the environment, I suppose. Because now that I think about it, I can. No, wait. There were depictions of people and farmers working in atrocious conditions. There was that, but I guess I just felt that there was less of a focus.
But I should say that for our American listeners, that naturalism is a much greater thing in America, featuring authors like Stephen Crane and Jack London and Dreiser and Frank Norris. So it's it's very much a like a it change it how big of a deal naturalism is incredibly dependent on where you are. So
Makes
in
sense.
the UK, it's like, oh, we say that, oh, there's Zola, and that's pretty much it. But obviously, that in some countries like Scandinavia or the Netherlands or America or, as it turns out, Portugal, there is quite a big naturalism.
Yeah. I mean, just like how Brazil and Portugal were the only countries that had ultra-romanticism. Because like I don't know, that's at least was how it was framed when I learned about it, that it was almost unique to us, if not completely unique. Um, I guess naturalism. Yeah, we're still on that one.
Yeah,
Any
that's
particular
that's.
any particular
I would definitely.
ideological? Okay, if you finish before we start talking on top of each other.
Yeah, that was what I want to say about literary naturalism, and obviously, visual naturalism continues very much in the footsteps of visual realism, in that it has to do with people in the real world painted in a quite a photorealistic way, although often it doesn't have to be about poverty or inequality anymore. You can also have like alienation in terms of the city, but it's still visually similar. And I would definitely say that naturalism has a very strong connotation, if not perhaps politically, culturally, with the idea of like the bohemian, right? The like a city dwelling, quite moneyed intellectual who lives a very lavish and havocous lifestyle.
Yeah, the bohemian lifestyle. Kind of hilarious how the term bohemian in this context originally meant essentially gypsy to now what it now means. The bohemian academic lifestyle, because like a lot of like bohemians were just academics, like people who were in a university or university adjacent.
Yeah, but essentially, I'd say politically, the bohemian is mostly tied to anti-establishment thoughts, whatever they are. So that's going to be the underlying notions of naturalism.
Next up, we have, if I'm not mistaken, modernism.
That's right, the big one.
Modernism.
Now,
Um,
modernism is fascinating, and I
like
mean,
a
I can
lot.
talk a bit about literary modernism, and then if you want, you can talk a bit about visual modernism.
Sure, I'll try, but I'm not so certain I'll be able to do a good job on this one.
Okay, well,
But
we'll see. We'll see what happens.
yeah,
Yes. So modernism observes in realism the focus on types and says that this is ridiculous because I'm not a type, I'm a person. And so it focuses once again on the individual, perhaps in a way looking back on Romanticism, that it's no longer necessarily only concerned with exceptional individuals. Right, and what it wants to really observe is the internal experience of the individual. And so you see a lot of things like stream of consciousness and free association and the breakings of grammar rules, essentially trying to portray the chaotic nature of human thought. Another important part that this is part of modernism is trying to break with previous norms.
These norms being any possible previous norms. They were not. They did not. They were pretty encompassing in what norms they decided to break then and there.
Yeah, no, I mean it was all about what new norms could you break. It was trying to go forward in breaking norms, and so in common themes for the modernists were perhaps things that the realists had approached indirectly. Like they would look at where the realists had seen inequality after capitalism, they would give us a new word, alienation. Right, so they were very interested in people being alienated, people being anxious, people being scared, and people's experience of these emotions. Like if you look at Knut Hamsun's hunger, right, it's all about, and we don't even perceive a name for our protagonist. We just have the first person internal monologue of a man walking around Christiania being hungry, and of course the hunger is very much not only a physical hunger, but it's also a metaphorical hunger for acclaim as an artist. Very deep, yeah. And obviously, a lot of modernism can be difficult to read simply because of how much how many layers of allusions and metaphors. They're very very into metaphors, allusions, and references, and all of these things that can seem very daunting to read. Like if you look at modernist work like Ulysses by Joyce, I mean it's a behemoth of densely packed streams of consciousness. Every chapter is written in a different style. It's because it's all about breaking with norms to portray life.
Yeah. Also, slight depressive undertones, depending on the artist. Well, I guess writer in this context.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
some
I'd
people.
say
Now, for visual modernism, is while written modernism still had definitely an angle of like social critique, analysis of the individual. Modernism, visually, and I guess in plastic and in the other plastic arts outside of like just painting, was much more focused on just breaking norms and disputing what is art. The famous example being the sculpture, I guess, called the Fountain, which is an inverted urinal. That just being the art. So a lot of individual arts, modernism, and its later non indirect descendant, postmodernism, were weird, with clearly a greater focus on just breaking the mold, questioning what is art, what makes art, what is and various attributes of art. But this is not to say that they did not have elements of dealing with alienation, because oftentimes, because like and this is inherently within the question of like what is art, basically, is that a lot of times they went through these to these shall we say, absurd displays and works and pieces to kind of emphasize, in a weird way, the alienation, I guess the viewer would feel in relation to art. Because like one thing that's now kind of not quite, I mean, I guess we still have it to this day, no matter where you are. Like art, when you think of art, you think of this like, you think of art in golden letters. You think of pretty museums with with art in a center stage. Like art becomes this unreachable thing, and like it kind of it becomes like abstracted in your own mind. And modernists painters did kind of wanted to shake up that dynamic by both showing in a way of appreciating in an appreciating way the art of like the artistry that is involved in literally a public urinal, which is a weird choice, but I can understand it. And also to kind of like demonstrate like how, because modernism, visual modernism was weird above all else, because it tried to do a lot of the things at the same time, being critical of art in of itself, being critical of the art watcher in of itself, and art critics and bourgeoisie sensibilities in general. So visually it was much more weirder, and but I do not personally, at least, consider it to have missed the mark compared to literary modernism. Especially when we go more into the paintings, they not only get more depressive, but also that the element of alienation is more clearly manifested, as opposed to the somewhat meta way that that they get around it in sculpture and other mediums.
Yeah. As for the politics of modernism, I mean, obviously they are varied, and they are not as explicit as they would be with something like realism, simply because social commentary isn't as much of a priority in modernism, as it's more focused on so-called central themes, so like life and death and the big shit. Yeah, and what it means to be human, and so that makes it less overtly political. However, there are of course still political elements to it, and you can, I think, see them as sort of a continuation of the themes in naturalism. So there's essentially a trend of being anti-establishment, as of course if you're breaking norms, it's very hard to be pro the people who make the norms.
I mean, in general, modernists are like if we painted the previous movement as being just anti-establishment, the modernists are anti whatever is dominant at the time. So it's a bit difficult to explain without using the word anti-establishment. Is that they were, because it's like in modernism where you start really having the bizarre rivalries between artists. So some of the works are just anti other artists I don't like. So make of that what you will, listener.
Yeah, definitely get a
Awesome.
lot of great artist rivalries in modernism.
Come again, sorry.
But yeah, you definitely get a lot of great artist rivalries in modernism.
Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, it's just
Yeah, but I
like
mean, I think we might have to revisit modernism at another time, just because it's so huge.
as we might have guessed, listener, Bronze likes modernism.
I do like modernism.
Which honestly one wouldn't expect. Now, on to the next one. Futurism.
Gonna have to let Mikosk take charge of this one, simply because there's not really an English-speaking futurism.
Oh, that is but a sadness. Futurism. And as you might have guessed by how I speak of it, it is my favorite artistic movement, especially in poetry. Actually, does there exist futurist painting?
Yeah, of course there does.
Yeah, but isn't over here futurist painting just like gets reduced to pre-cubism, for lack of a better term, which makes sense, but I don't necessarily. In any case, in a slight inverse of the trope, this time it's your boy Kosk talking about literary futurism, specifically
Yeah, just before to interject a little bit, if you want to look at what visual futurism can look like, you can look at Gino Severini's dynamic hieroglyphic of the Baal Tabarin, which it's going to be in the description.
which again just smacks of proto-cubism. I guess simply over here in Portugal, like the visual aspects of futurism get downplayed somewhat, because like where the visual aspects of futurism get upplayed is like in architecture, but like actual paintings and stuff down over here it gets downplayed in favor of the poetry. Now, futurism can very simply be reduced to a celebration, ecstatic and bombastic, of the now and the tomorrow, where the previous movements saw essentially, if not to be very reductive, doom and gloom brought about by the city and industry and capitalism. The futurist sees liberation unmitigated. It sees itself in the tremendous energies of trains, mines, cannons, boats, explosions, dynamite, all that is intense, powerful, and consuming. And in this manner, you can kind of see a return to Romanticism in the focus on emotion, almost separated from the individual. And to me personally, the highest expression of futurism, not only in Portugal but in the planet, calling it here, folks, completely completely objective, unbiased, is the Triumphal Ode by Álvaro de Campos, which is also my favorite poem and potentially the greatest poem, period, ever. Totally humble, totally unbiased. And in that ex libris of Portuguese of the language, you have a man, which might be the the writer, might not be. It is irrelevant. A man that is just loving it, and that low key wants to fuck a train. Is a hallmark of low key. I think he openly says it, that he wants to fuck a train. And
I'm
this
not
is
sure
kind
the
of another
futurists
element.
did anything low key.
Yeah, it's absolutely not low key, but the 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 entire an element to futurism is this orgasmicism and like again a focus on emotions, but also like sexual metaphors. Sometimes subtle, rarely. Other times, more commonly, very obvious. But still, and this poem is like genuinely is like a microcosms of like futurism, because the poem dictates very bad things. Like there is a part in the poem about 6-year-old children masturbating old respectful men, and the character slash the poet straight up saying, "I love this and I find it very beautiful." It is like this élan vital, this almost at times ecstatic and psychotic happiness, love, joy, and adoration of the future and the future that there is to come. Indeed, fact, you have almost an elevation, especially in the poet, but there's also another themes in other poems about the elevation of the machine above humanity, and well, self-evidently above the elevation of current industrial production, industrial making, sometimes even above God, but especially and very focusedly, like the classics have been bested. We have now completely surpassed all that came before us. The dawn of the new age is here. And again, to go back to the triumphal ode, about how atoms that might have been in the past Plato and Aristotle are now the atoms in a car, and how this is like good. How the protagonist of the poem, which again is unclear if it's the poet or if it's like an abstract character, wishes he could be as complete and fulfilled as a car just fresh off the production line. There is a lot of this just energy, emphasis, and crescendo to an oftentimes orgasmic analog ending.
Yeah, and also just I quickly want to mention, simply because it is interesting, the matter of futurist cuisine.
Wow, I wasn't expecting that one, Chief, gonna be honest.
Yeah, well, I mean, we got to touch on the culinary arts once, and because I'm mainly familiar with the Russian and Italian futurists, which are I'd add those were the two biggest countries where this happened. I mean, the culinary thing is mostly the Italians, and they wanted to create a wholly new, wholly Italian way of eating. And so they, for example, contrived of restaurants that had in the dining room had like jet engines from planes running.
Well, it's unlikely to have been jet engines because they weren't invented yet, but
There was a big loud. I mean, an airplane engine inside a room is going to be loud.
yeah,
It's
even
going to be an
jet or not.
experience.
Yeah, it's gonna be an
Yeah,
experience.
yeah, and they thought, we need edible clouds and meat sculpture, and we have to eat with our hands because knives and forks are French. Recipes are French, and so we need to refer to them as blueprints and so on and so on.
Yeah, again, futurism had it's definitely tripped up on its enthusiasm a lot. Also, an angle we're kind of forgetting is the in visual art of futurism was cinema. I'm not terribly familiar with this angle, but futurist cinema was a thing, and it was quite a big thing. I think more so in Germany than in Italy or Portugal or what have you. But it was a thing that we must mention, even though neither of us is particularly familiar with it in any effective capacity. But onto the politics of futurism. Well,
Bit of a touchy subject.
the stereotype, and indeed fact, a tragic truth most of the time, especially in Italy, was fascism. A lot of futurists, especially Giovanni Gentile, pro-fascism, strongly pro-fascism, very much nationalistic as well. Though note, the nationalism was a hallmark of the poets. It's not so self-evidently clear in the poetry, at least in the Portuguese variant. In some ways, it's kind of self-evident that the connection is, but like the big, when talking about fascism and futurism, it's kind of the big question is, did futurism create fascism? Or was like, are the two separate phenomenons that just just by luck, just conjoined very well.
I think they're definitely related in their origin.
Because an element me and Bronze kind of forgot was masculinity. Futurism, big on masculine energy.
Yeah, I mean, in Marinetti's manifesto of Futurism, which is sort of the founding document of the whole thing, in Article 9 is, we intend to glorify war, the only hygiene in the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of anarchists, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and contempt for women.
Just contempt for women. Futurism, the gamer artistic movement.
It was very gamer.
Just, oh god, I had forgotten about Giovanni, like the manifesto. It's kind of weird. I should remember that, but eh.
Yeah. I mean,
But
I think if
contempt
the
for.
futurists were alive today, they would definitely be gamers.
Just playing League of Legends like the best of them.
Exactly, like they wouldn't have time to make meat sculptures and hate pasta because they would be busy on the road to diamond.
Hating woman and minority. Oh, oh god, I'm now just imagining fucking Marinetti playing fucking League, just calling everyone else on fucking text chat boosted bitches.
And I think on that bombshell,
Yeah,
you know,
this is definitely going to be a two-parter. We'll do part 2 somewhere in the next 10 years, but
maybe it's a soft promise on the next 10 years part.
yeah, you never know. But as Bronze was saying, on this revelation that the end point of futurism is the League of Legends gamer. I have been your host, Makosk,
And I've been your other host, Bronze. Good night.
and this has been Monarchism Unfiltered.
Good night.